I get fiery about this because oftentimes as a having been inside companies and watched this in my client work, you put regulatory in this place of being completely out of the loop of the development of the message. And then you plop an ECN on the desk of that, that professional and say, sign this, we're going to print tomorrow. And I don't have enough information. The only power I have to stop this and protect my own reputation and the reputation of the company is my no. And so, yeah, you're right. They become the no people or the anti-sales. But what if we had made them part of our creative process so that they were coming along with us? And maybe they would have thought of things, if they're any good, by the way. And if they're not, then you got the wrong person. Maybe they would have thought of things that we didn't think of as smart sales and marketing people. So another best practice is having a ideation creative session with either an external marketing firm or internal with our own resources. That's a process that's populated with regulatory, quality, R&D, not just sales and marketing, not just the ad agencies, but instead really getting a more fulsome group of individuals to bounce ideas off of and tell you where the lines are, because isn't that really what you want to know?
Welcome to the Message Engineer Show. I am your host, Maureen Shaffer. Today we have Colleen Hittle with us. Colleen has 30 years of regulatory, clinical, and compliance expertise. She rose up through the Anson Group to become a managing partner and then owner and CEO, negotiating a successful exit to Navigant after 17 years of organic growth and success. Colleen spent time at Navigant before founding ProVeritas Partners 4 years ago. Colleen has an industrial engineering degree from Purdue. So welcome to the Message Engineer podcast, Colleen.
Thanks, Maureen. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I like to start with a few words, what I call define the word warm up to get started. And so what I'll do is offer up a few words and ask you for kind of your thoughts and opinions and kind of definitions of them.
Okay.
So, all right. One near and dear to my heart, message or messaging.
I think for me, that is the lens through which we communicate. And in a world of product development, which I know is kind of where most of your audience is very focused, I think each of us brings a lens through which we communicate. And that's the beauty of multidisciplinary product development and how we are able to ideate and continuously improve on ideas and concepts. So for me, the message is the lens through which you're thinking about an issue or a problem. And many voices lead, in my opinion, to kind of better outcomes.
Great point about the idea of kind of the lens through which we see things, and also the idea that many voices lead to a better outcome. Maybe a slightly longer decision-making cycle, but a much better outcome at the end of the day. So really critical. Marketing.
Well, early in my career, someone told me if regulatory and marketing get along, that's a bad sign. That somehow that's a problem. That those two need to be kind of averse. Always in battle for the words on the page. And I took that to heart. I used to think that regulatory and compliance needed to be the police. And as I got involved in more startups, both on the company side, but also as an investor, I came to appreciate the marketing is really powerful, can be really powerful. And marketing for me now means how do we all, just to pick up from that last word, how do we all message around what this thing or service does through all of our various different disciplines. And so for me, marketing is now power. It's not something to be fearful of or control, but instead to add to, again, through maybe regulatory quality or compliance, at least in my case, how do we empower them with more information so that we can, be more successful against our competition? So.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. The idea of kind of empowering versus the police approach, right? And most marketing people and a lot of my clients I still hear a lot of that of viewing, kind of regulatory and compliance through that lens. So what did someone call them? I'll remember later.
I've heard people call them like the no police, or, like always looking to find a reason not to be able to say something rather than help me get to the yes. And so I think the best regulatory people often are being creative. They're trying to be creative. And that's where I think sometimes having a more technical perspective on regulatory can be more empowering, more helpful, because you can be thinking about, what can I say yes to support marketing?
Yeah, I think, that gets into, I want to ask you one more thing, and then I'd love to circle back to that. So risk.
Well, in the world of consulting, and now I think I've spent more years consulting than I did in-house, it's all about risk management and understanding your client's risk tolerance. And a lot of startups have, more appetite for risk because they have less maybe to lose. Now, some might argue that no, if you lose your reputation early on in your launch, then you're sunk. But let's just maybe say financial resources. Most startups don't have the deeper pockets that some of the big multinationals do. So in the world of consulting, risk to me is really about understanding your risk tolerance so that I can bring my advice around risk management or mitigation to you, and really understanding what you can tolerate, where your areas of tolerance are around risk, and how to help you make choices informed by that risk tolerance.
Yeah, that balance is a great point about risk management and risk mitigation, right? Because there's no world with zero risk.
No, for sure. And it's about where you want to take on risk and what you're willing to accept. And then I think if you've done a good job, again, back to the world of consulting, if you've done a good job with risk management, then you've contemplated, okay, if this happens, what can we do with that? And so then you're getting your client comfortable with, okay, yeah, we could manage that. Here's some things we could do. So your contingency planning, if you will.
That makes a lot of sense. So one of the things I'm interested in is maybe walking through, right? Because a lot of the audience is around Medtech startups and digital health startups and all those folks who fall under the banner of Medtech at this point in time, which is a growing.
It is growing.
Yeah. Very, very rapidly, and the investment along with it, thankfully. So, and you've had the opportunity, right, as having a consulting company to go in and kind of see in multiple different companies what's happening. And I'm wondering, at the beginning, if we walk through, let's say, a life cycle of a startup from, let's say, there's a beginning and a middle and an end, whether it's like at concept or day zero, like design freeze or submission, and then commercialization. Let's say US for today. Then what are some of the things that you've seen as kind of best practices kind of at the beginning, maybe the middle and the end, and or flip it over? And what do you see a lot of your clients are missing? Kind of along that life cycle.
Yeah, I love that we hadn't rehearsed that, and that was like, that's the best, easiest softball, because it, as you get further in your career, this, I've done a lot of M&A and diligence work, and so I've had an opportunity to communicate to my client, like, look, this is what we see as strengths and weaknesses of this asset, and here's what you would need to do on your day zero to mitigate the risk. So, I'll take it from the flip. I think one of the biggest mistakes medtech startups make is not appreciating design controls, earlier in the process. And for sure, there's a lot of in med device, there's a lot of flexibility prior to kind of that design freeze. But even kind of going back and having to create, your device history, prior to design freeze is tough if you haven't done the job of documenting. So for me, a best practice is having even the bones of a quality system that has done some amount of documenting, corrective action, design inputs, any kind of V&V that's been done. It's the framework of a quality system, and that does two things. The point that I made a minute ago, which is kind of starting, your design control process, but you've also then embedded a culture that respects and recognizes quality and compliance as a big part of our future success. And so often you see these startups that have great ideas, might be really smart technically, but they've not built a culture of compliance. So then, God forbid they get acquired, but even as they're working with partners and in product development, they don't have that culture of compliance kind of built in. And so the framework of a QMS does both things. Number one, provides that, compliance infrastructure, but then it starts to plant the seeds of culture within that first group of R&D.
That makes a lot of sense. The idea that you have, the QMS or quality management system in some form so that everyone knows it exists. And it is well known then that this is a critical part of kind of who we are and how we do things, right? So what do you think should be happening then as it relates to, let's say, like labeling very broadly at the beginning, right? So people are always out there talking to other people, whether you're selling or pitching or, what kind of things do those kind of day zero or day one companies need to be thinking about in their, let's say, their QMS or some other system as it relates to kind of messaging, whether it's, right, they're not in full commercialization, but they might be putting out a press release. Maybe they got some seed funding. They want to let them know they exist, or they hired some important, someone to be their CEO, et cetera.
Yeah. So 2 points. Number one, a bare bone procedure, process, cheat sheet, FAQ, something that you're putting in the hands, especially of those that are on the front lines, to your point, anyone that's writing a press release, anyone that's speaking to a KOL or at a meeting. There should be some yeses and some nos, some guidelines. Ideally, it's in a documented work process that's been approved by the appropriate individuals, but I recognize that's probably not always realistic. But at minimum, they've got a cheat sheet. Like, can't say this, it's okay to say that. If they ask this is what we say. So we have kind of just like a common playbook, so that we don't start running our mouth and just get too reachy, if you will, on either the product's status in product development or what we hope the product will do ultimately in the marketplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense to have kind of this, like, I was almost envisioning, like you were saying, like a do not, like you can do this, say that, do this thing. You do not say this, say that.
Yeah.
Kind of do these things, certain things to avoid, kind of in that pre-approval, pre-clearance kind of time frame. So what do you think kind of when people are, I won't say the mid stage of the company's life cycle, but let's say, midway through their first product launch or service launch or product and service launch?
Yeah. So hopefully by that point, they have some kind of a regulatory opinion document, something that assesses the classification or categorization of the device itself according to the code, or if it's a PMA, what's our plan for approval? Because usually if you're saying mid-launch, that means that I've got some pathway to the market. So then you're getting much more informed by your competition, other people in that same product code, what their marketing claims are, what the regulators think our claims can be. Sometimes a company is in an exempt status, maybe it's got a 510K. So then it's much beefier, right? You're putting into the hands of those folks managing launch. This is what we do, this is what others do. And so then it becomes more of a competitive landscape, trying to think through same, different, better, that kind of language, more comparative language. So it's certainly much more robust because you're much further along in the regulatory strategy of the product and can say much more about others in the marketplace. Or if you're the first, what's the unmet need?
Yeah, to really thoroughly understand that. And then I'll just jump to commercialization, and then we'll circle back again. But commercialization, I think from a kind of systems and compliance kind of best practices and or what's often missing standpoint, and then I'd love to talk about the kind of no police. I think it was the anti-sales department.
Oh, there you go. That's it. That's it. That is a good one. Yeah, I think commercialization, just to pick up on the kind of mid-launch, in commercialization, you have more post-market experience with the product. Maybe you've got some clinical studies to talk about. It's much more in the hands of the user versus, earlier in product development, you're dealing with a lot of either bench or, anticipatory kind of performance of the product. Whereas once you've launched, you're getting it in the hands of actual users and getting to talk about what the kind of outcomes are. So that's where your post-market data comes in, and the experience of KOLs and publications and things of that nature that can be much, very powerful at that stage of product development.
When you look at companies that have done, when you go in and they have some kind of, they're in some tangle with one of our regulators, the FDA or the DOJ or others, what do you often see startups are missing? What do you think sometimes they don't? You mentioned design controls before. What do you think what do you see that they're missing a lot of times? So I'll give you a bit of background to that. When I was the VP of Marketing, Education, Reimbursement at AtriCure, we had an indication for soft tissue ablation. But cardiac surgeons were choosing to apply it to cardiac tissue to treat atrial fibrillation, so an irregular heartbeat. And we had clinical studies underway under IDE for cardiac. We had clinical studies underway for AF, for atrial fibrillation. So we're doing the right thing. So one of the things I found most informative as I sought to build a robust kind of compliant marketing department was the Pfizer Corporate Integrity Agreement, their CIA, because it detailed the systems that the DOJ expected them to have and follow. And so I kind of took my cues from that. And I'm wondering, that was 20 years ago. So I'm wondering kind of what are some of the best practices in those kind of unclear situations, and what do people need to be thinking about that they're often not?
It's a great question, and I don't know the background of AtriCure, so nothing I should say should suggest that I know the specifics there. But FDA has always been clear that when it comes to off-label use of your product, that they expect that within design controls, you're anticipating how users might be prone to using it off-label. And I don't know if the AF would fall into that category or not, but maybe it sounds like if you were studying it under an IDE, you had anticipated that was not a indication for use for which you had direct approval. So documentation within your design files is key for off-label use. In other words, all the way through, your V&V, but then once the product is launched in your post-market experience, gathering both in real time and in publications all the different potential off-label uses of the product. That's a mandate. That's just a requirement. And being able to document that within your design controls is a powerful mitigation for when and if a regulator would come to you and say, hey, what about this use of the product? We have reason to believe it's being used off-label, and here are the problems with that. So that's to specifically address that example. But broadly, your question was, what do companies miss? And I think the biggest thing that's missed is understanding. Remember, we were talking about message at the beginning, understanding how FDA, or God forbid, the DOJ communicates, right? The message. Right. What does it mean when they ask a question about, I'm making this up, an adverse event that they got within their database that they're following up and trying to ask information? Is that a bad thing? What are they getting at? And better being attuned to managing FDA communication at the outset before things start snowballing or getting out of control, reading between the lines a little bit, or just understanding more how FDA operates. I think that's one of the big misses. And that's where I think some companies do find themselves, in a bad situation when they haven't even realized that was where they were headed. So maybe naivete. And then I just think it's just as a completely different point, what I heard you say about reading the Pfizer consent decree. I mean, that talk about scorched earth. that would have been like, kind of worst nightmare, when you were, running marketing at that company. So that's like the worst possible scenario. So if that's your Bible, or at least that's the thing that keeps you up at night, anything less than that, I think you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, it was. I built systems where we eventually, a whistleblower showed up, not from our company, but from the field. I don't even remember which company, but there were like 5 companies in this space. And there was, I don't even remember who it is. And I got a phone call saying, hey, we need to produce we need to produce discovery to the DOJ of everything that's been sent to anyone kind of since the company started. Yeah. And I was able to say, because we sent everything, I had built a system with another software company, that everything was sent at that point, BlackBerries, but sales could literally like punch in an email address and select what they wanted. Yep. And we wrapped it with all the regulatory disclaimers, with the marketing brand. And if it had to be routed, we'd route it appropriately. And like if they're asking for a scientific article or something like that, we'd route it through clinical for them to take a look at and decide yay or nay and forward it on. And so all of that was documented. So we were able to produce that in 24 hours. So that's how I read it and kind of what we implemented, and it helped marketing, right? We could see what people want and what they opened and what they're interested in, and sales could get it faster, and we didn't have to worry about which revision they had, because the minute we uploaded something new, bam, even if they sent them an email a month ago, they have the new revision when they clicked on the link. So I really did take that to heart, because I wanted us doing the right thing and saying the right thing, and still getting out there and shouting from the hilltops, like how great we are.
So what you're describing, I think, first of all, is amazing and is a best practice, of course. And what you're describing is the objective evidence of a QMS, right? I mean, those individuals, to even say I have a revision level means you've got document control for those documents, right? Those peripherals, but also the training and education and awareness of those people to use email that's on the server, to live by some, those guiding principles. I mean, because it's one thing to say, okay, you have an inquiry from DOJ, send us everything that you've sent on this topic. But the sister to that is the knock on the door for the audit itself. And that's where the QMS becomes such a powerful tool to be able to support the how these documents are shared, and the controls around there, the training, the way that you bring awareness to sales and marketing around the sensitivity of some of these points. So to me, it's what you described, and the foundation that you build that on is a QMS that everybody respects and lives by.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. We also had the pleasure of being audited by the FDA, just the marketing department while I was there.
Interesting.
And we passed with I don't remember, it's whatever, no written
483s. Yeah.
Yes, no 483s.
That's by itself impressive, because as you know, that's usually if FDA is going to come, I think at one time it was 70% of audits, result in a 4 at one time. Don't quote me on that data today, but it used to be the case that the vast majority got a 483.
Yeah, that was one of our competitors. So I have a question for you, because it was interesting that you said that there's more, and I agree. I agree with that. This idea that there's more risk tolerance in startups, perhaps, than in larger companies. By the same token, sometimes I've seen where the easiest way for a large, like multi-billion-dollar multinational to mess with you is to mess with startups, is to catch someone doing something that is inappropriate. Mm-hmm. So, for example, what triggered that audit specifically was a sales rep stapled an off-label, peer-reviewed scientific publication to a product brochure with their business card. Thanks for that. And that's why they showed up. Yeah. But we were able to demonstrate that that's not how we did things.
Right. Through training, So
we were able to say, hey, that was one rogue person. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, when you think about startups having, generally speaking, right, a higher risk tolerance, which makes sense, what do you see relative to kind of competition, the multinationals? Have you seen other incidents of this where they try to catch startups doing something wrong and get you tangled up in some?
Sure.
So it doesn't mean you shouldn't be called out if you're making mistakes. I'm not saying that.
Yeah, no, I certainly have seen that. And, I have had mixed experience with FDA following up on those things with any consistency, and it kind of makes you wonder, like, why do some get an inquiry from the DOJ and an audit from FDA, and some get nothing after years and years of, bad behavior? And the cynical side of me can offer a couple of theories there, but let's set that aside. I'd like to believe that our government and FDA is risk-based. And so maybe there's certain product areas that just don't lend themselves to, a lot of there. If there's not a big post-market concern, if there isn't a lot of strong patient advocacy where there are potential risks, you can see where there might be a class of products. And honestly, some of that in high tech, in software and such. Whereas more of a deregulatory kind of environment. But back to your point about risk tolerance with startups, there are, and that was a general statement. It's certainly not true across the board. I could argue also that I have, in my consulting career, seen a lot of very, very large companies who have, because there's so many layers of management or regulatory scientists or clinical or whatever, there's this kind of we're all in this together sentiment where we're a little bit complicit in some of our pushing the envelope and, a little bit of groupthink and convincing ourselves that that's okay. So there are for sure big companies that take big risks because they have gotten that way, through their own successes, honestly, or being able to skirt or skate by the regulators in some key areas because of their name, and their name recognition or influence, if you will, in parts of FDA or with the government. I'm always like scratching my head sometimes and I look at like, how do they get away with that? But I was just making a general statement about risk tolerance. And for sure, when you have big companies that have boards and compliance committees and a lot of infrastructure or have been burned, once bitten, twice shy, right? By DOJ, had an FDA consent decree or something like that. I think by and large, my statement is probably true if it was borne out in the data, but we've for sure seen, outliers in that respect.
Mm-hmm. One last question. I want to jump back to the regulatory marketing piece, or reg clin quality compliance and marketing piece, and sales. I'll throw sales in the same bucket with marketing. Is what are some of the things that are going on right now that we med device, sales and marketing, or regulatory clin quality should be attuned to or paying attention to as pertains to either some of the things that are happening in enforcement, some of the things that you see happening around auditing, anything you see happening around I think digital health to me is like has so much promise, has done a lot of, and all that kind of ancillary piece of that so much. But I also see that a lot of those folks come from outside the life sciences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So are you seeing anything that we ought to be attuned to that's shifting in kind of enforcement or policy decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would not, my comments are not going to be unique to digital health and what I'm about to say as a first step. Mm-hmm. For sure, in a post-pandemic world, we're seeing enforcement, more of the FDA activity in that post-market compliance area. It's easy, it's cheap. I don't have to send an auditor out. So what does that mean? It's promotion and advertising, it's website, it's meetings, publications, and in that respect. And it kind of lines up with the CERs and what's happening, in Europe around, the new MDR for CE marking. And then, of course, the adverse event database and reporting and such. I have a lot of clients who are getting just those over and over again, those inquiries around, hey, we noticed an uptick in adverse events on this particular technology. Can you explain that? But I think that's more a product of limited resources and trying to be risk-based. They're looking at their own signals, through post-market data to try to do some enforcement without, using an auditor to get on a plane and go knock on a door. So to your question, what am I seeing as a trend? That's a trend for sure. I haven't seen a lot of specific enforcement in my own digital health work, but that's certainly not, the only area I practice. So I would probably want to ask someone who's unique and only focused on digital health, what the trends are in that respect. For sure, we're seeing a lot of, more guidance and standards development. So, I would suggest that's coming at some point.
Yeah, no doubt about that. One, I think at the end of September, there was one just recently that came out, or they revised and issued guidance. So I want to just kind of switch. So we've talked a lot about kind of the life cycle and what people need to think about, risk tolerance, risk management, and kind of the controls and that, to really thinking about following and using design controls which exist for everyone's benefit. including the patient or the recipient of this at the end of the day. So regulatory marketing. So I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of really great kind of regulatory, clinical, and compliance folks. And it's one of those kind of relationships, as you mentioned before, that the no police, or I've heard it called the anti-sales department. So, and I don't believe any of those, but there is that, and I still get clients saying to me, "Well, regulatory said I can't say that," and I'm like, "Well, but why?" This is coming from sales and marketing, right?
Yeah.
People I'm doing CEOs and sales and marketing. And I'm like, but why? I don't know. They just said I can't say that. But why? Right? Like, so what are some things you've seen? What do you think like marketing is missing or sales and marketing is missing about establishing a positive relationship with regulatory? How can we do better to help the company grow and have strong, right? To have a strong message and strong campaigns. I mean, can you walk me through some best practices?
I've got a lot of ideas about this. And I'm going to try and organize my thoughts. I'll start at the top, and the first is company culture. And I point to executive management as setting the tone for how we resolve disagreements, how we ideate, how we encourage, various inputs and ideas that maybe don't align with each other. Part of it is literally the culture itself. And what the culture drives is hiring. And some people use regulatory as a police, and they hire for that. And that's a problem, because then you've automatically put that person by their background or reputation or experience in the role of being the conscience of the company. And that's not only not fair to the individual, it's a discredit to the discipline. And I get fiery about this, because oftentimes as having been inside companies and watched this in my client work, you put regulatory in this place of being completely out of the loop of the development of the message. And then you plop an ECN on the desk of that, that professional and say, sign this, we're going to print tomorrow. And I don't have enough information. The only power I have to stop this and protect my own reputation and the reputation of the company is my no. And so, yeah, you're right. They become the no people or the anti-sales. But what if we had made them part of our creative process so that they were coming along with us? And maybe they would have thought of things, if they're any good, by the way. And if they're not, then you got the wrong person. Maybe they would have thought of things that we didn't think of as smart sales and marketing people. So another best practice is having a ideation creative session with either an external marketing firm or internal with our own resources. That's a process that's populated with regulatory, quality, R&D, not just sales and marketing, not just the ad agencies, but instead really getting a more fulsome group of individuals to bounce ideas off of and tell you where the lines are, because isn't that really what you want to know? Where are my lines?
Right.
And then
it's like, don't drive into the ditch, don't drive off the bridge and land on the Potomac. Don't, right?
Yeah. And then I think what happens to some sales and marketing folks is that they just get angry and frustrated, and they're like, they won't let me, but yet they're not really engaging in a way to settle the difference or find a middle ground. And maybe it's just easier for them just to be, frustrated. I don't know. So again, best practice culture, the right hire, a person that's not just a no person. And you got to figure that out when you're hiring regulatory. And P.S., good regulatory people they're hard to find now. We can talk about why, at another time. But and then the third point is just encouraging sales and marketing to bring regulatory and compliance and legal and clinical along for the ride and make them part of your creative process rather than just having them as an approver and expecting them to just simply sign off just because, they feel pressure.
I think that's brilliant to bring in. All those folks will be weighing in on the ultimate approval, right, of any content, let's say, and to bring them along, not only so that they're on the same page, but more importantly, to be able to say, you said kind of where the lines are, right? Which I interpret as, hey, you can't say that you want to say, but you could say this. Or you could say that if, or when, or, right?
Yeah.
But developing a kind of understanding very early, because as you said, it sets everyone up for failure if marketing walks in with the ECN or the DCN or whatever the company calls it, right? The document that says it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Sign it off.
Yeah. There's another point that I failed to make in my passion I forgot about, but it has to do with the environment. I think sometimes sales and marketing people get frustrated because they said, well, last year they said such and such, and now, what's changed? And yeah, lots can change. You've got, other enforcement,
I've heard that.
Other companies, people coming into the market, what we've learned from post-market data. It's not static. And it's important, if you respect the voice of regulatory and compliance in this multidisciplinary product development team, the kumbaya, then you also have to realize that sometimes the environment shifts, and it's always important to continuously assess risk by product, by company. And so sometimes the answer can change, or the guardrails might look a little different. And that's not where only regulatory says the no, but again, in a healthy culture, we're exchanging these ideas and deciding as an executive team or a management team, what we can live with.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, that if the approvers, regulatory, quality, clinical, whomever's appropriate, right, are part of the process of developing, let's just say sales and marketing content broadly, that then they can provide and you've hired the right people to begin with, right, who aren't the police from the regulatory and quality side, that then you have the ability to create something really terrific together. And throughout that process, right, because these things take time, if things shift, then the regulatory has the opportunity to guide marketing to mitigate the risk as things shift and change. So I think that's critically important. And you mentioned a word that I don't often hear spoken relative to, and I'm putting like reg, clin, quality, all and compliance in the same bucket, but regulatory spoke relative to regulatory marketing's relationship, regulatory and sales. That's respect. And I was wondering as you were talking about that, if what you thought about, do you think one way to develop that respect might be involving people kind of at the front end and working together? Like, would that help? Are there other things that would help? How do you help build respect or create the environment or the culture for respect between departments that are often put, up against each other stereotypically?
Yeah. I have a couple of ideas about this. I think the one thing I'm super grateful for is that I got my start as a young engineer in an environment that really respected regulatory. They were very product focused, very technically astute, clinically astute. So so I trained in an environment where that wasn't a problem. And I came in, I was in this rotational program, and most people would say like, oh, all the cool kids go to marketing or R&D and nobody cool goes to quality or regulatory, but that wasn't the case. I mean, there were great opportunities in quality and regulatory. And so kind of early on in my career, I drifted to that discipline rather than, product development or manufacturing or whatever. So what I'm saying isn't necessarily true about every company, but it's where hiring is so key. If you're hiring a no person that doesn't have any technical product experience, then you do set yourself up for sales and marketing to not respect regulatory. I mean, that just is, it's hard to argue that, right? And most sales and marketing people really know their product. And if you have a regulatory person that doesn't, then you're not creating true peer relationships. But you asked what are some best practices, and one that I've seen be very effective, and this doesn't work for every company, is bringing sales and marketing along with in your regulatory journey. Having sales and marketing sit through an FDA meeting, through a Q-Sub, looking at the deficiency responses, really understanding where the pushback from the regulators are, rather than letting regulatory be that single voice after the fact, bringing the commercial people into those settings so they can hear in real time what FDA might be concerned about or your notified body might be concerned about. Because otherwise, they may be skeptical. Is regulatory really telling the true, or is this they're just they're just worried that we're going to get in trouble? Is that really a problem? Yes or no? And so one best practice I've seen is really bringing those commercial people into the regulatory discussions so they can hear it firsthand and understand the risks firsthand, rather than through the voice of a single regulatory person.
That's a great, makes me think about a couple of things. That's a great idea. I've never done that, actually.
Well, I had a client.
I've been involved in, when you think about what's our clinical plan look like? What's our product plan look like? Publication plan look like? Definitely, right? Because we're always in regulatory from the standpoint of which indication do we file for? Do we go for like what we want at the end? Do we stair step this? Right? And then you stair step clinicals along with it oftentimes. So, it's really interesting because I can remember like a video in my head of it was like my office, like a 6 feet, the copy machine, and then the door to the main corporate boardroom essentially, which is where FDA was when they did that audit of my department. And I saw my Marcom manager sitting at the copier the whole time, like making copies for but I had no idea it was like a black box.
Yeah.
Right? Like a black box. And at the end of the day, I would, go talk to the VP and I'd say, a reg client, I'd say, how'd it go? What happened?
Yeah.
Right. So, but how eye-opening would that have been if I were actually just as an observer, not saying anything.
Right.
But to have learned from that.
It's important what you just said, and I wanted to make sure that I put the finer point on that because I don't want to be taken out of context. It doesn't work in every company, and that person that the observer needs to know that they're there to listen and not to talk.
Oh, I'm super clear.
Our meeting, we want to bring you in for perspective, but so again, doesn't work in every company, but it can be helpful.
I think that's a great idea. What it also made me think of is I oftentimes with R&D, like when you're going through this development, right, concept to kind of launch and beyond, and there are always these points where they say, oh, well, marketing's requirement is, or marketing wants, and every time I'm like, time out. Marketing doesn't want that. I don't want that. The customer has told us they want that, or the patient population, the healthcare consumers have told us that's what they want. This isn't coming from me. This is the marketing department holistically. is the customer's requirement.
Yeah.
So I think that's the same thing made me think that when you said like regulatory and bringing marketing people in, because oftentimes it's, well, regulatory says, or, right?
Yeah.
But where it really is, perhaps the FDA says, or recent enforcement, action tells us, like there's evidence.
That's a cultural thing, right? I mean, we've become so egoic in these big entities that marketing, what is marketing? I mean, it's a group of human individuals with ideas, and we're all marching to some marketing plan that's informed by customer need, unmet need in the market. So I'm with you. Like, part of that's a cultural issue. And when we throw that term around, it divides us. It creates this kind of us versus them mentality, which again is not going to lead to better outcomes, more creative, inspired. Let's all be on the same page kind of, launch, if you will, in your example.
So you talked a bit at the beginning about culture and environment. And so I'm wondering, you talked a bit about hiring kind of regulatory people, right? And what to avoid, right? The police approach, and what to lean towards, like the more kind of creative, flexible approach. What are some of the things in kind of culture or environment, and which I know is like a massively overbroad question to ask you, but are there a couple of things you've seen where you say, hey, that was a really great idea, or this is a really great idea, to try to bring the culture, create that culture of, you said something about resolve. No, it wasn't resolve. I don't remember the exact word, but it was basically to lessen conflict. You used another word, though. You used the glasses half full word. What are some of those things that you've seen really help bring the different departments together to help understand kind of, that culture? I'm not phrasing it correctly. But like, what are some of the best practices for culture that help imbue kind of risk mitigation and back and forth as opposed to conflict?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of these are kind of big and weighty, and so I recognize it's not pithy and tactical, which is what some people, when they listen to podcasts, want. So I'll give you a couple of weighty ones that are much more aspirational, because you're asking about best practice, and in my consulting career, I've had a great opportunity to see some very high functioning teams and some not high functioning teams. And so I'll give a couple of examples, and then we'll get to pithy and tactical. Okay. If you see a commercial organization that is full of VPs, decision makers, and your regulatory and compliance and quality people are director technicians, you're not going to have balance within your organization. And I don't mean you have to have a VP of regulatory in every business unit. That's not what I'm saying. But you can't establish these peer-to-peer relationships if you're treating regulatory like submission writers, and that's it, or keep us out of trouble people, and that's it. So it really starts with a job description that is a true companion to and peer to the business. And if your culture doesn't respect and bring quality and compliance at that level, executive committee, compliance committee, if they're not equally represented, then you're fighting a difficult battle, right? In terms of finding something pithy and tactical. A lot of times, and again, a lot depends on the risk of the product, because maybe that is appropriate for some product areas. But in general, I would say that the most performing companies set out to provide the intellect, experience, and respect of that function: compliance, regulatory, legal, clinical, compliance, all the things we've talked about, which I recognize in every company aren't necessarily together. They need to be peers to these business folks and have the same voice. And, that's executive leadership, bringing those people to the table and holding space for their ideas, and not putting them just in that no category. So that was weighty and aspirational.
I think that's a great point, though, because you think about that in kind of when you think about kind of DEI initiatives, and that is that you look at the power structure of an organization, right? And you say, at the highest levels of power in an organization, do we see what we're saying we want to be? Or do we just see that at like 5 levels down
Yeah.
in the organization?
Right.
So, and then the power structure is going to,
yep. And
it all flows downwards, right?
Yeah.
So your point about putting certain people on a essentially higher pedestal, like if you have SVP of sales and marketing, and then you have the director of regulatory,
right,
you're setting it up to, right, not have that. And we know, right, they've studied decision making, and they've studied boards,
right,
and when you have a mix of people and different types of people, it takes a little longer to make decisions, but you make better decisions. And financially, the companies do better.
Right.
Like,
so
they've shown
why are we still so far behind? And, regulatory, I don't mean to make this a gender issue, but you do see a lot of females in regulatory. And oftentimes it's the single female in an executive leadership team, maybe HR, but the rest are oftentimes men. And it just becomes a stereotype. And it's one that it's tired, it's very tired. And it really is up to those executive leaders, in my opinion, it's on them to create more diversity. And again, I'm not making this a gender issue, to your point.
Right.
It's every kind of diversity to make that more balanced. Because that is why we've gotten into the stereotype of regulatory being the no police. It's like you're the mom. It's no different than HR, right? So I think a lot of my best friends are HR people because they've probably been in the same position. So you were asking about some other ways to do it, and those were weighty and aspirational. But let me give you a few, nuggets that are better clickbait and more tactical.
Things that people who aren't the CEO could potentially,
or like, okay, I can't act on that. Yeah, I'm sorry. That doesn't help me today. I have seen really a good use of regulatory and clinical input in this, in design controls or product development processes, where you're really including them at the table. Do an offsite for a couple of hours. Whiteboard, what are some really big wins for indications for use or off-label promotion through what clinical trials are we going to design and run to expand the use for this product, and really getting regulatory and clinical, and again, depends on how the organization is structured. Do an offsite with the ad agency. Don't hold all the glitz, for sales and marketing, because sometimes when you're more of an operations regulatory person, it looks really fun on the outside. You're going out to all the medical meetings, you're doing all the promotion, you're getting all the pens, and that feels it's true. Right?
You getting all the pens.
Yeah,
that's why
the booths and all the things. Bringing regulatory along for that and having them be part of that strategy. What is our medical meeting strategy? And having them be a voice in that. Again, some tactical ideas for how to start to balance that out a bit.
It's almost it's interesting because I've definitely heard in my career, hey, it's not, I'll throw this one out there. Hey, it's not fair. Like, from a marketing person, sales gets paid so much. And I'm like, I said, if you would like to apply for a sales position, I'd be glad to, kind of support that. And they're like, I was like, what they do is hard. Yeah. I don't want to, I've never wanted that. I don't want to be out there doing that. I admire them and I respect them for that, because that's not something I'm particularly good at. I think the same holds true for regulatory marketing. And what's really fascinating is that I've definitely heard the comments over the years to your point about, oh, you get to go to all the fun places, so you get to go to all these meetings, so you get to go XYZ. And I think, the reality is a little different.
Of course. Yeah.
Reality is a little different. But the easiest way to lessen the conflict and that, how should I say it, the perception of, it's almost like it's not power difference, but kind of sort of, that perception is to, bring them along.
Right.
Have them come with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, just from a marketing standpoint, that a thing I'll toss out here that I haven't thought about in a long time until I was listening to you talk about it is I often have focus groups. I would often have focus groups on the industry side at these major meetings. And I'm sorry to say that it never occurred to me to invite kind of ClinReg.
Yeah.
And that would have been really great because they have a lot of clinical background. They have a lot of, right? We could have come up with something that was even more powerful than what my teams have been doing. So I think that that's a great idea to bring them to trade shows, but also the things you do, like the dinners with the KOLs and the focus groups and the other things that go on, so that they have a better understanding of real life and how this happens, and they can help support that or ideate, like you said, ideate on solutions.
When I was a young engineer, I was in the cath lab. I mean, let that settle in. And I was in regulatory and clinical, not as a product development engineer, right? And not every company thinks like that. And I recognize the controls are different. That was in the 1900s.
Right. Please, you look so good.
But it is powerful. It's powerful to hear the people that are using the products. Like, you don't feel like what you're doing is meaningless. So.
Yeah, that why. Like, why are we here?
Yeah.
Why are we here? How does this matter? Yeah. How do I tie into this? And I think that is super. That is really I think critical.
The other thing, Maureen, that of late, and I say this in terms of a trend in my own consulting work. There is a lot because of the EU MDR. There's so much regulatory transactional work. This the CERs, all of the remediation, if you will, to get into compliance with those new requirements. It's not dissimilar to when design controls, went into effect in, again, the 1900s. So we've lived through these, right? But kind of these trends of like regulatory, the perception of regulatory is limited when there's just stables of people, I'm making this up, writing CERs versus what is our strategy for compliance? It's kind of almost elevating the discipline to something that is much more as it was intended, rather than kind of a come from behind and clean up the mess kind of. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it completely makes sense. And one of the things that when I was at HK, I had great colleagues in ClinReg, one person who's the VP of ClinReg and another person who's the VP of Quality. And we talked a lot about the idea of building in compliance. Like, right, it used to be you'd build let's say a product. You build a product and then you'd inspect the product, right? You'd inspect out what failed,
right,
as opposed to building it in kind of at every step, right? All those checks at every step. And so we started to talk about, how do we build in compliance? How do we make it a no-brainer for sales and marketing? How do we design a process where there are all these checks and balances, where we mitigate risk and make it easier for sales to do their job?
That's brilliant. And I'm all on board with that. And I've seen that in other high functioning companies that run much more efficient regulatory teams. You're kind of creating these centers of excellence where the people that know the thing are doing that thing and only that thing, rather than this brute force method of everyone's going to write a CER until CERs are done.
I think it's easier. It was literally the three of us. We all committed that we would show up every week. I bought lunch, and the company bought lunch, but it was like, well, marketing can buy us lunch, right? I'm like, not a problem. So, because that's what, it's what marketing does, right?
And the pens, don't forget the pens.
I never brought pens. Food, no pens. And yeah, next time I'll bring the pens. But I was really lucky that the three of us agreed that we would always show up. We wouldn't send substitutes. We wouldn't. Like, this was super critical for the company. And that was, in large part due to their commitment as well, that we were able to do that. So it's not obviously practical at a lot of organizations.
Yeah. Were they both women? I'm just curious.
The VP of ClinReg was a woman, also an engineer, mechanical engineer, right? So I have an engineering background, as you know, and biomedical engineering, and the VP of quality, he came up through engineering. I don't remember which discipline. Yeah. So we had three people who kind of thought about processes similarly.
Right. And knew the product.
In different disciplines. Yeah. So, but I think building it in and getting everyone to be thinking about it regularly, and your points about bringing marketing into as an observer only, no talking, to a QSub meeting or an audit, and vice versa for trade shows, because our VP of ClinReg and oftentimes VP of quality would come to our events and our trade shows as well. And there was a lot of value there that they brought.
And a lot of times in bigger companies at that level, if you have an SVP of regulatory or clinical, a lot of times they have become more standards people or, compliance people. And again, I think that's an important role. But what I mean is really those that are driving the product strategy. So I just want to make sure we're not getting lost in title and forgetting about what I'm really describing. And it is the person whose job it is to position the product in the marketplace through submissions and compliance and that kind of thing. Because a lot of times at that higher level, it's really people that are working on AdvaMed or, standards committees, which isn't a very important thing, but it's slightly different than what you and I were discussing.
Right. Kind of earlier stage companies where it's a little bit more of kind of, all hands on deck.
Right.
Yeah. Not the multi-billion-dollar global companies.
Right. Who can afford an SVP that doesn't.
Hierarchy. Yeah. That has to operate very, very differently. Very, very differently. So I love the ideas you brought forth a lot of great ideas, respect, how to develop respect, how people should be situated and equivalent kind of positions of power to set people up for, being collegial peer discussions, right? And bringing folks you went from other departments into situations or opportunities or meetings or trade shows or other things where they can kind of see in real life, right, that it's what's happening, why it's happening, and kind of understand the basis. I think it's really understanding kind of the basis for some of these things, right? Like, why would marketing say that? Well, because the customer said. Or why would regulatory say that? Well, because, right? Regulatory doesn't sit at home thinking through, like, how can I mess with the marketing department and make their lives more difficult?
And on both sides, there should be an expectation that those individuals are bringing those explanations to the table and having those conversations. It's not just about saying no or just because marketing said so. It's having dialogue around the why. And if you're not getting that from regulatory, then you've got the wrong regulatory person. And same to be said for marketing, of course, but I think it's something I know less about. I mean, I can tell you seeing regulatory people that just a bad fit for an organization, but maybe the CEO brought them in because they wanted a no person.
Right.
It's easier for them. And so I see how it happens, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think explaining the why behind that, like we did this survey or we did the study, the last focus group we had, or, from a marketing standpoint, we can offer a lot of, or sales, other than just sales wants this. Why does sales want this? Why is this important? How will this allow us to differentiate ourselves from our competitors? Like more of the story to it. Being, of course, is brief, applying brevity, but trying to deliver the kind of why. And the same from regulatory. If regulatory doesn't offer it up, asking, or vice versa. marketing doesn't offer it up, ask why.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that the case? Or why do you see that as such an important piece of this product, service, et cetera?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think, I hate to sound like I'm nostalgic for the early days of my engineering career, but maybe I am.
I did love that
It
company.
was so good. It was such a great place to learn, wasn't it? Ugh.
That was amazing.
But really, it was a startup, Maureen. When you think about it, it was a startup at that time. And I think they did a great job of bringing everybody along in the explanation of what it is this product is going to do and why it's, and not just like the glitz, but the underneath, why that matters. We had a lot of opportunities to connect face to face and exchange ideas and enthusiasm. And I think two things have gotten in the way of that. And I don't think we can't solve either one of them. Too many meetings, too many, our schedules are too packed to do that anymore. There isn't space for that in companies anymore. We've tried to figure out how to be efficient or whatever. We're, the 8 to 5 schedule when you're booked every hour, it doesn't allow for that. And so that's a problem, in my opinion, because you're just missing out on that piece of it. We've got so siloed in that respect. And then I was going to say social media, but I won't say social media, much technology. I think sometimes while it's great that you and I can be on this computer and see each other and all that, it's not a substitute for, bringing in the presence of another human and solving problems together. And back in the 1900s, we sat in a conference room and did design meetings, design reviews, and shared ideas. And it's just harder, I think, now.
I think it is more, it's interesting. I do think it is more challenging now. I think one of the kind of superpowers that Cordis had was from concept to launch, you had everybody in the room.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember
the same people.
Clinical was in the room. R&D was usually a couple of R&D folks. Marketing, not sales. We were like their proxy. Marketing was their proxy. Quality, regulatory, everyone was in that room from the beginning. The minute the project was like, okay, go ahead. Everyone met. I seem to remember weekly. And we had some discussions. And some debates in those meetings. But when we left, it was all still collegial. We knew we were all after the same goal. And I still look back and wonder, how did that happen? Like, was it because HR and the training was so good? Like, was it just a unique group of people? Was it?
Yes, all of that. I think they were all components of it. The culture, the voices, the respect for the various voices, but also we were, and not to overplay the fact that we were all physically in the same room, but they were the same person too. And I think that's one of the inefficiencies in a lot of today's models is if you don't have the same individual that stays with a product from beginning to end, you're constantly doing a handoff to a new regulatory person or a new quality person or God forbid a consultant. Trust me, that's what I do. Which is not as efficient as having, a more consistent, resource that, again, really steeped in the product. Remember how much product training we got? I mean, it matters if you see how the thing is used in a real clinical setting and carry that through to launch. So.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. I think that idea of having the same people, consistency from concept to launches, there's so much that's lost when that shifts.
Yeah.
And so much retained when you're able to keep the team together from beginning to end.
Yeah.
You understand, I've seen it where, because I've been on those teams, you understand the product in a very deeply in a way that can't be done and this is a marketing thing, not a compliance regulatory thing, but when they split them into upstream and downstream, And this idea that someone who's more techie should do upstream and someone who's more like stereotype, rah promotional, I'm going to do all the Marcom stuff, and go hang out with sales and get all the, I called it the guts and the glory, upstream and downstream. There's so much loss when you like toss it over the fence to the other person, even if there's an overlap, even if you come up with the best possible ways to kind of pass the baton there's a lot lost. And I think that's hard.
Yeah. And I would add, at least on the compliance side, the product failures that you would see in manufacturing or returns from customers, the value of putting your hands on that product or seeing how it performs, in the lab as a return, or like I said, an in-process manufacturing failure. I'm, hearkening back to my days as a manufacturing engineer. There's nothing to be, you cannot substitute, putting your hands on and seeing physically product failures. And yes, there's a lot of good, video and SEM and all of that, but it does two things. It helps your brain learns differently when it's physically, evaluating something. But it also, and this is a softer point, again, it goes to culture, and that you just get a little more invested in it when something comes back from the field and it's, broken or didn't work. And you're trying to think through like, what did we not get right here? Or maybe we did, and it's just it's a failure that's anticipated. But I think both matter.
It is interesting. I think that whole, we all learn differently, right? But the more we do know that the more senses we employ in learning something, the more we learn it more deeply. So for like touching, right, tactile, and we see it, and we kind of, whatever else may come into play.
Yeah.
Hopefully we don't smell it. But the more senses come into play, the more feedback you're really getting, right, about what works or what doesn't work. And the same holds true for, for marketing, being involved in that as well.
Yeah.
Because there's always the question, at least I've run into this a lot, like, sorry, that's user error. They weren't trained properly.
Right. It's all.
Yeah. That's how they do their procedure.
Yeah. Well, guess what? We're obligated to track that in our design process.
That's how they do that.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case, right? And that's the FMEA, and that's a lot of other things, right? But like, what is a reasonable control for, have you anticipated these things? What are the reasonable controls and so forth? But I think that's always an interesting conversation. I've seen a lot of that's user error, or put in the IFU. And I'm like, nobody reads the IFU.
Yeah. And that better be in your risk management plan. That better be in your FMEA. That better be something that you're looking at continuously. Is our post-market experience reflective of what we thought, when we set out?
Right. You always learn, right? You learn, and then, right, you learn and you iterate.
Yeah.
And you do better, hopefully.
And I just want to clean up what I said about the value of seeing product failures. I'm not suggesting a regulatory person should live in, a product failure return lab. I'm just saying that goes to the respect for the discipline. If you're in post-market surveillance and if you've never seen the way product returns work, it's the part of my job in auditing that I love so much, because there's just no substitution for, actually being in there and seeing the process and how it works. And again, maybe it's to your point, maybe because I'm more of a visual learner. But I had a project recently in a supply chain project, and we had the meeting in the distribution facility. And that really helped me to think through how to, reduce risk, because I was actually in the place where the thing was happening. And I think that's what we don't have enough of in today's world. And I know we're doing lots better in other areas. So maybe it's just a sign of the times that makes me sound like an old lady, but.
I think, they say seeing is believing, right? Or pictures is worth 1,000 words. And they say those things for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's different when you go stand in the cath lab,
Mm-hmm.
right, and watch it, or when I stand in surgery, right? Because I can say that they don't look at the IPU. They don't even touch the outer package.
Why? Why don't they? Because somebody else broke the package down for them.
Right. Yeah. Because the circulating nurse hands it to the scrub, like takes it, dumps the outer package, does this, and then the scrub nurse who's scrubbing sterile pulls it out, then takes it out of any inner sterile package and hands it, right? I don't see any of that. Never. So I think, putting it in, I love that idea of, talking about supply chain and being in the distribution facility, because then you're in their environment. You can see things and say, oh, okay, this would or this wouldn't work, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're not in that environment, I think it's easy to come up with, I've certainly made this mistake myself, to think that I have some brilliant idea about solving something. And then they're like, that's not going to work because, right? Yeah. So I love that idea about being aware where they are and seeing it. And I've been, in the products returns lab and with R&D evaluating return product. Mm-hmm. It makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. It makes a big difference. So it's, and I think the one thing, you talked about meetings, stacking them up and interfering with them. I'm wondering if I have my own way of doing that with my business. Ensuring that. And I'm wondering if you have, because when I was in industry, it's the same, right? Electronic, right? Computer, you gotta love it. Everyone sees your schedule. And then I would try to block time, right? I try to block like 7 to 9 in the morning because I'm a morning person to get a lot of work done. And then people would note, they'd say, Maureen, you're completely booked for the next week and a half. But I noticed you have the slot every day you've blocked at 8 a.m.
How dare you have a boundary?
There? And I'm like, So suggestions for how, like in the ideal world, you wave a magic wand, right? What are some ideas around how to get back to this kind of critically important cross collaboration, kind of more strategic thinking, and less of running from one meeting to the next meeting, to the next meeting, to the next meeting. So you are exhausted at 6 p.m. and you're like, oh, my to-do list. Yeah. That's great. Now I can get started.
Well, I have 2 answers. I'm not great at doing it myself personally, which is where I thought you were going. And that's because I'm in a service business. And so my client says it's at 7 a.m. It's at 7 a.m. and I'm going to have to do something else to make it work for my life. But you were really asking a broader question around organizational efficiency. And I think there are ways to make organizations more efficient, but only, I would want it to only be to create more space for people to think and do other activities, not so they can just shove more meetings into that space. But driving decisions to the people that can make the decisions. I know that sounds weird, but having an SVP, I'm making this up, of regulatory signing off on a PMA supplement that person didn't touch or write is silliness, right? In terms of inefficiency. Mm-hmm. So training and hiring people that can make decisions at whatever level is appropriate, but driving that lower in the organization. So you don't have these multiple layers of review for people that aren't adding value. If you're only making someone sign for awareness, then that's a waste of that person's time, in my opinion. They should get aware through some other means, because there's so much documentation that burdens companies and this, the review process and, spitting out new revisions of documentation, procedures and ECNs. There's just a lot of labor associated with the tactical technician side of regulatory and quality and compliance. And so to the extent that we can simplify processes, drive decision-making lower in the organization, those are some strategies that, and then I mentioned this earlier, the centers of excellence, making sure that people do the thing or the best person to do the thing, and then maybe grouping them in that way rather than spreading CERs across the whole organization. Again, I'm just using that example but we use ad promo just as an example. So using COEs more effectively. Again, you got to hire the right person. Those are some ways to create more space in an organization.
Okay. Yep. Hire the right people, give them the responsibility and the decision-making authority appropriate to their level and the training to support that. Try to free up more time for other people are often copied. I've seen that.
Yeah.
You really need me in this meeting?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, well, I just wanted to make sure you knew about it in case you don't have to be there. I'm like, terrific. If you need me, let me know. Come on, grab me.
Yeah.
But otherwise I'll let you be.
Yeah.
You have who you need.
So many meetings happen now without documentation. I find this fascinating. Like the reason we need 20 people in a meeting is, does anybody really write down what happened and send that out? And that way, if you can't go, like sometimes I come to a meeting.
Agendas, right?
Down what we decided.
Agenda.
Yeah.
Even if it's like 5 points, 5-point agenda with sometimes attached to it and then notes afterwards.
Basic hygiene, meeting hygiene. And instead we're just jumping on a Zoom and talking at each other and then hanging up and going to the next one. So you could skip a meeting if there were 3 sales and marketing people. Maureen's in that meeting, I don't need to go. But it certainly boosts your confidence if then you can also see what was discussed. Even again, like you said, even if it's just the basics.
Yeah, it's like a summary. Yeah, and I think there are things like Otter AI and coming along trying to help us with those things.
Exactly.
Right. So hopefully that gets a little better. But you still have to have an agenda, right? Start with the end in mind.
Yeah.
If you don't know where you're going.
If you're going nowhere. Why we're here? Why are we here?
I had that conversation. I asked that question yesterday. My favorite question is, so what's the goal? What's the goal of the meeting? Why are we talking today?
Yeah.
What are we trying to achieve today? Any version, to your point, any version thereof.
Yeah. Yep.
So that, we get on the same page and march forward. Well, we talked about a lot. Lots of messaging, lots of marketing, regulatory and compliance and quality and commercial review and how to get along better. And but I think what really strikes me is that the relationships are, yes, you need to drive to results and outcomes and there needs to be output, right? But the development of the relationships is something that that needs to be emphasized because you're just going to make better decisions. You're going to have the right people in the room. You're going to make better decisions. Develop more respect amongst the folks. So,
and where we started, when I was thinking about this conversation, I was really thinking about your people that listen to your podcast are probably also thinking about building more value in their asset, right? And how to do that and how to make it more attractive, either for an acquisition or for some strategic partnership or more,
fundraising. A lot of times it's
right.
It's fun. What I usually find is it's fundraising and revenue generating.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, very few people recognize the value of understanding kind of the end game. Like when we get into the commercial, what do we want to say? Not like, the entire training manual, but what are our key kind of message points? And therefore, are we testing for that?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have the right tests? Are we testing for that? Are we building the clinical, if there are clinicals, right? Before the submission, are we building those things into the clinical submission so that we can eventually say them? Or do we have a publication plan to get to be able to, right? To saying them. And then are we asking what type of indications are we asking for? So I think that got to start with the end in mind and think through the message earlier and involve all these people and all the relationships and all the kind of equivalent power structures and all the things that the insights that you've shared today to make sure that we're making the right decisions as we move along and the best decisions for the company, which are also the best decisions for providers, whomever it may be, and users, whoever they may be.
And you're creating the right objective evidence that demonstrates compliance not just for an investor who might do diligence, but, big picture, when we do get ready to sell or partner or whatever. So when we first started this conversation, we were talking about best practices. And I think I really had that in mind, through the lens of doing a lot of diligence auditing. It's just so difficult when a company hasn't built that foundation from the beginning, because it just costs more and takes longer to kind of go back and recreate. It's difficult to recreate, some of those early design files and records. So.
Yeah. And I think, I've definitely seen it where there's much more of and I'm sure you've seen this as well, right? There's much more of a push for speed early on, as opposed to, I'm trying to remember to whom I said this earlier this week, but I said, and this is something I learned from my regulatory friends, right? If it's not documented, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So I think it's, I think that idea of starting with the end in mind and starting early, and often with the documentation and thinking through design control and putting these things into place makes it, I've heard the phrase pay now or pay more later.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right? You get behind, it's so hard to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, stay ahead, know where you're headed, all get on the same bus, drive in the same direction. Find a way to get to know each other, right? Know each other and understand each other's discipline.
Mm-hmm. And that's where regulatory sometimes does find themselves in a bad reputation, right? Because they're having to do the cleanup, and that's not the funnest part of the job. And sometimes it's necessary and appropriate. It's when you find yourself in that position over and over and over again, it's just like a product of bad planning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I had a regulatory friend of mine call me a couple of weeks ago and say, "Hey, could you take a quick look at this website?" And so I went as a client of hers, and I went and took a look, and I called her back and I went, "Oh my gosh." And she said, "Oh, did I mention they don't have any clearance or approval yet?" And I was like, no, and some more no.
Yeah.
She's like, "I thought maybe I just wanted to level set with a marketing person."
Sanity check.
I was kind of shocked. And I'm like, I was shocked. Like, you have every right to be a bit taken aback by what's out there. So a lot of claims of safety and efficacy and may have the potential for currently studied, none of that. Just all these big definitive statements.
They bypassed the regulatory person in the change notice for that one.
I was like, how did that happen? She's like, "Well, I think that's why they hired me." I'm like, crooked, glad. Yeah, so we've covered a lot today. Thank you so much for your time. It was great
to be with you.
To talk and reconnect. And that's it for now for the Message Engineer podcast. And like, subscribe, follow, and we'll see you next time on the Message Engineer podcast. Bye for now.
Thanks, Maureen.